Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. So much has happened since I last sat in this seat. So we'll catch up with all the latest from the fallout of the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, which happened on Saturday. And I will never forget the moment I woke up on Sunday morning to that news, having had an early night. And then, of course, the US political calendar just rolls on as planned. The Republicans are meeting for their convention in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, which is one of the swing states. And so that's about to get underway, even after all the events of what's happened in the last few days. And there for the BBC is BBC World's chief anchor, Sumi Somaskanda. Hi, Sumi.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And also joining us is host of Americast and a little radio programme called the Today Programme, Justin Webb. Hi, Justin.
From the Orange.
Hello there.
So, Sumi, I mean, just give us, there's so much we could catch up on, but give us some of the sort of major developments on the timeline since we last did an episode of Newscast on Sunday.
So much, as you said, has happened. So there was the assassination attempt on Donald Trump at that rally in Pennsylvania. All of the questions that have been asked about how this could happen. Congress has called for an inquiry. They're holding briefings, looking into what happened with the Secret Service and their plan for that rally. We've seen the president, Joe Biden, hold remarks. He said that he's launching an independent investigation into what happened. He also said that those results will be revealed to the public. He made a call for unity in an address to the nation as well, where he said, look, we may have our differences, but we have to settle those in a civil and peaceful manner. He said that he called Donald Trump after the shooting. He managed to reach him on Saturday and had a short phone call with him. We know that the First Lady, Jill Biden, also spoke to Donald Trump's wife, Melania Trump, briefly on Sunday. All of this flurry of activity, of course, after the nation really has just been in shock after that assassination attempt. And then we saw Donald Trump saying, look, I'm not going to let a shooter or assassin stop me from going forward with my plan, so I'm heading to Milwaukee. So he arrived here in Milwaukee on Sunday evening. He stepped off the plane. There were hundreds of his supporters there to greet him. And he has now said that he plans to go ahead with his program here at the Republican National Convention. And now we're hearing this morning two huge pieces of news. First of all, that a judge has thrown out the criminal case against Donald Trump for mishandling classified documents. You know, Adam, many people will remember some of those images that were, went around the world of classified documents that were being stored at Donald Trump's residence in Florida, in a bathroom, in the ballroom. Well, the special counsel, Jack Smith, brought a criminal case against Donald Trump for that. And the judge here, Aileen Cannon, said essentially that special counsel, that his role violated the Constitution, that he didn't have the authority to bring that case. So that is a huge piece of news. We saw Donald Trump reacting to that already, saying that is great news and all other cases against me should be thrown out as well. And we are now expecting Donald Trump to announce his nominee for vice president. It was rumored that could happen on Monday, the first day of the convention. And our news partner here, CBS News, has also said that he's expected to make that announcement in the afternoon. And we could possibly see Donald Trump here at the convention center. It's been filling in slowly with delegates arriving. But it is rumored that he will arrive here this afternoon and perhaps might speak as well, ever so briefly, we believe, because he's expected to speak later in the week as well. But that is what we're hearing today, and so much has been happening, Adam.
Sumi, that was an excellent summary of an avalanche of news, and that is why you're the chief anchor for the BBC World News Channel. Let's zoom in on some of those things, and I should say that we're recording this episode of Newscast at 5:34 on Monday evening. So while you were listening to this, actually some of those things may have developed even a bit further. Justin, just first question to you. Are we learning any more about how this could have happened? I mean, you don't need to know anything about American politics to know that the bubble of security around the American president is the tightest security you could imagine.
Yeah, and it's not just security on the day. That's the other thing that I remember from my time in the States and actually watching presidential tours around the world as well. I mean, I followed George W. Bush once to, of all places, to Sedgefield, to Tony Blair's old constituency. And you land there in Air Force One at the nearby airport, and they ferry you in a helicopter, in a Black Hawk helicopter, to the then Prime Minister's house because they don't think the roads are safe because they haven't been able to scan them. And they brought their own fuel as well, I remember, for the Black Hawks because they didn't trust British air fuel. So there is a huge amount of effort, no expense spared effort that goes into the Secret Service's work in normal times. The allegation now is that that effort didn't go into this. So they hadn't scanned it enough in advance. They didn't know that there was high ground there. They weren't liaising properly with the local police. And further, some Republicans saying, you know what, the Secret Service has gone woke, like all other institutions they accuse of going woke. It's too much diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they point at some of the pictures that you saw on television, particularly the female security officials who looked on occasion as if they were a bit lost. I mean, goodness, you'd expect that you would do in those circumstances. But there's all sorts of pressure now on the Secret Service and on the individuals who are concerned. Again, saying, why was he allowed to do that fist pump in the air? And made a great shot, probably the iconic shot, possibly the election-winning shot. But actually, that's not the way the Secret Service rolls. Generally, when there's a danger to someone, to the principal, they bundle them very, very roughly into what they regard as cover, whether it's onto the ground or into a car or whatever. You have to look at the pictures. They're all online of Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt back in 1981. There was no kind of fist bump or any of the rest of it. They were on him, physically on him, and down to the ground and into the car. So why did they allow Donald Trump to do all of that? Because if there'd been another shooter, the point being that they would have got a shot in. So my goodness, there are questions, and real questions, not just sort of fake ones from conspiracy theorists. There are real questions about how on earth this all happened.
And Sumi, I hadn't quite clocked just the quite long-running discourse that had been around the Secret Service. Because we in the UK have that sort of Clint Eastwood line of fire, their uber professional kind of cliched view of them. But actually, it doesn't take a lot of digging to see lots of claims, some of them maybe a bit spurious and a bit conspiracy-ish, but some of them actually seemingly quite potentially valid, going back the last few years about the Secret Service.
Yeah, that's right, Adam. And I think it's important to note, like you said, that a lot of conspiracies have been circulating online since what happened on Saturday. And it's important to keep our focus on the facts that we do know at this point. But I think one of the most important points is what Justin mentioned, is the questions about the Secret Service's organization and what they say, what critics now say is this woke shift within the Secret Service. And we know that Congress has actually called the head of the Secret Service for a hearing as they're demanding answers as well. There have been questions asked about the ability of the Secret Service to carry out security at such big events. And in fact, you know, one of the questions asked in this case as well is whether Secret Service had adequately actually canvassed the area and whether they had the right plan in place to make sure that someone could not climb on a shed 150 yards away. So this is indeed going to be a very difficult moment for the Secret Service as this massive convention is underway. They say they've got it here and that security is good here.
Right, let's talk about President Biden's response. We saw him doing remarks a couple of times over the weekend that then culminated with that kind of like the real box office thing an American president can do, which is sitting at the desk in the Oval Office, taking over the TV channels and doing that presidential thing. Let's have a listen.
You know, the political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down. We all have a responsibility to do that. Yes, we have deeply felt strong disagreements. The stakes in this election are enormously high.
I mean, Justin, there's so many things there. First of all, just Biden widening the scope of people who've been victims of this kind of thing to include all parties and all levels of politics, not just making this about the attack on Donald Trump.
Look, I mean, I don't know, maybe it worked for some people, but it just felt to me to be a rather bloodless, I don't know what Sumi thinks, it needed, I would contrast what he said in that very formal, stilted setting with what Josh Shapiro said. Josh Shapiro is the governor of Pennsylvania. He's a Democrat. He's one of the people who many Democrats believe should be the presidential candidate this time round, rather than Joe Biden. And he, for me, just knocked it out of the park because he said all the things that you'd expect the kind of comforter in chief to say. So in the state of Pennsylvania, where this awful thing happened, He talked about the fireman who was killed and his family, called him a hero. He'd talked to his widow. He'd talked to his daughters. It was just something immediate and from the heart. And it didn't mention other political violence. It just concentrated on this. And to me, I think to a lot of Americans, what Biden said, I mean, okay, he ticked all the boxes, but the stuff about violence was quite boilerplate, really. I mean, it was all, everyone says there's no place for violence, but he didn't really address any of it in any detail. And he didn't, crucially, I think, just do this stuff that American leaders are meant to do, which is talk personally to the people who'd been involved.
Well, not to compare events at all, because they're incomparable, but I always remember coming home one night after work, after the Sandy Hook massacre at the elementary school, and watching Obama's address about that, and being so, like, it was, I hate to say Shakespearean, because your Today programme co-presenter Amal Rajan says it's a really weak comparison, but it was an extraordinary bit of rhetoric at a moment of immense national tragedy.
And you think back to all the others. You think of Obama, you think of Bill Clinton being able to do it, you think of Ronald Reagan back in the day being able to do it with the Challenger disaster. I mean, it's actually the job of the president, Adam. And I don't know what Sumi's view is. I just feel that if you can't do that, I mean, in a sense, a bit cruel to say it, but, what are you for? I mean, there are all sorts of decisions that cabinet members and the Secretary of State are taking, and other people are chipping in on, the National Security Advisor. Your big moment is when there is a national moment of coming together, and you need to be able to do it. And if you don't quite manage to do it, it's tricky.
Sumi?
Yeah, we absolutely have to see these remarks within the context of what was happening a few days before the assassination attempt, which was this massive crisis in the Democratic Party over President Biden's mental acuity, whether he is the right person to be the Democrats' nominee. And, he was actually scheduled to speak for about 10 minutes, and we were all waiting for the address. It ended up being around 6 minutes. And I agree with Justin. It was quite short. It was quite dry. Of course, he takes over all the networks, so has a big audience there. I mean, I think the one thing that I took away from it that was a little bit interesting was a lot of questions were asked as to how will President Biden continue the campaign going forward after this horrible event. He did say, look, at the RNC, there are going to be people on stage who criticize my record, my policies. I'm going to be going on the road this week to talk about my record, to tout my record. And we have differing visions for America. And then he went on to say that doesn't mean that we have to resort to violence. So that gave us a bit of an idea of how he might proceed in the coming days. He's heading to Nevada, which is a critical battleground state. But I think Justin is right. I mean, everyone is hanging on President Biden, or has been hanging on President Biden's every word. And it probably wasn't the address to the nation that some people might have been expecting or hoping for.
Justin, just before you go, because I know you got to head off, but just before we started recording, you said, look at the Times, look at the Times. What did you want me to see there?
I'm just looking on my phone here. So the Times have got a YouGov poll. YouGov are very active. A lot of British pollsters actually very active and very respected in the United States. But YouGov have just done a survey, and it's kind of what you expect, but it's all the battleground states. So all the states that could potentially change hands. Most states won't change hands. California will go to whoever the Democratic nominee is. Texas, Oklahoma will go to whoever the Republican nominee is, which it will be Donald Trump. But there are probably 6 or 7 states that won't, that you can kind of fight over and think maybe go either way. And they will decide the election. And what the Times has said in this YouGov poll, I'm just looking at it now, is that all of them, all 7, are going to go to Donald Trump at the moment. And 3 or 4 of them have been kind of toss-ups. So, it's not a complete cratering, because that doesn't happen in this really polarized election. There are plenty of people who will still vote for Joe Biden, whether or not he can move his arms or move his lips or whatever, they'll still vote for him. And the same with Donald Trump. But at the margins, this does make a difference. And some of the margins in those states, if you remember last time round, I can't remember what the figures were, but the like 30,000 voters in an entire state were deciding these things. And if they all go against Biden, there is not a path for him to win the presidency. There just isn't. And that then reinvigorates the whole business, which has kind of gone off the back burner. Can you reinvigorate something that's off a burner? Anyway, you know what I mean? It reinvigorates the whole business of what do you do about Biden, which I think Biden and the White House had thought was probably dead, at least for a bit, because of what had happened to Donald Trump and this awful event in Pennsylvania. But now, these polls, and if there are more of them, will reinvigorate, because it kind of goes to the question, do we really care about this? The Democrats have been demonizing Trump. They've been saying he's going to be a disaster for American democracy. He's going to imprison his opponents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the most important election of all time. And then suddenly they say, oh, what the hell? We'll just put Joe Biden in, although we know from all the polls that he is very, very likely to lose. Or is that a moment where they say, no, actually, we believe what we've been telling you, and because of that, we're going to put even more pressure on him to go?
Justin, thank you so much. I feel like we've had our own little bonus extra Americast just for us on Newscast, so thank you very much.
Pleasure, Adam.
And Sumi, I've got you for another 3.5 minutes, so I'm going to give you a choice. This is multiple choice, your last 3 minutes. Do you want to talk about...
I was never good at multiple choice.
Well, I mean, let's make it as easy as possible. Do you want to talk about this judgment in Florida about the confidential documents case, or do you want to give us a little preview about the next kind of 10 hours at the Republican convention? Your choice. Take it away.
That's a really hard choice. Let's talk about the preview of the rest of the convention, because we are, as I said, expecting a vice presidential nomination, and because you might hear behind me, the crowd is actually starting to fill in. There are a bunch of delegates who are now starting to fill in. I'm just going to take a look over my shoulder. You see all the different state flags, and you see everyone kind of starting to take their seats as the program is expected to get started. So let's talk about that, Adam.
Well, okay. When do I need to tune in? What are the key marker points? Is it going to be J.D. Vance who's going to be selected as the running mate? And I was rereading his autobiography, which, I mean, he called it Hillbilly Elegy. Tells you a bit about his background.
Yeah. Certainly does. So there are about 2,400 delegates who are expected to be on hand to officially nominate Donald Trump. So you probably could tune in, in the next few hours, I would say, to keep an eye on what happens. One of the reasons you should definitely tune in is because we've heard rumors that Donald Trump himself will make an appearance here today. He might possibly take the stage, as we said a little bit earlier. So that would be something to watch, his first public appearance after that assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. And there are official speakers as well. Some members of Donald Trump's families, like his sons, Don Jr. and Eric, are scheduled to speak. So we will have to see who takes the stage first. We don't have the official schedule of that just yet. As for the vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance is rumored to be the forerunner at this point. And as you said, a lot of people might know him from that Hillbilly Elegy book. And we know that world leaders, I remember the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, saying he read that book and was in tears because he found it such a moving account of growing up in that white working class environment and making it to success, and that it gave a bit of an idea of what some working class communities around the world are facing. Look, I think one of the reasons that J.D. Vance could be the favorite at this point, that's what we're hearing here, is because he's been a staunch supporter of Donald Trump. He is young. He is a senator from Ohio, so that is an important state in the Midwest, of course, for Republicans as well. And he's been someone who's been on all the morning talk shows talking about President Trump's record and why he should be president again. He is someone who really made that conservative shift. You'll remember, Adam, originally he criticized Donald Trump and said that he didn't hold the solutions for the white working class. Now he's moved to become one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters, quite a political transformation. And he's been incredibly dogged in his criticism of President Biden. And he's been very critical of aid to Ukraine as well for our international listeners. So he's such an interesting character because of that transformation. And it looks right now, because he's also friends with the president's son, Don Jr., that it could be J.D. Vance. We'll just have to wait and see.
And it's so interesting in British politics seeing how many people here go, oh, I'm friends with J.D. Vance. Almost like they're trying to get in early. Right, Sumi, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Adam.
Bit more international news now, because the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, is in the Middle East. He's been in Israel, done various things like meeting frontline politicians there, meeting the families of the hostages who are still being held in Gaza by Hamas. And so I decided to catch up with our BBC diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, to get the latest on that conflict and also to find out what David Lammy can actually achieve or be seen to be trying to achieve there. And because Justin and the Americast crew were in this studio when I needed to have that conversation with James, I went to our other spare studio to have that conversation with James. Before we delve into kind of the daily politics of it, can we just step back and have a bit of a sit-rep about the Israel-Gaza conflict for people who've not tuned into it for a little while? And I know it's hard to sum up an entire thing, but just give us some fragments that will help us get up to date.
Okay, the fighting continues in Gaza. It remains incredibly intense. In recent days, the Israelis have launched quite a few strikes in different parts of Gaza. Particularly, they have been trying to kill, frankly, one of the leaders of Hamas, Mohammed Daif, who's they accuse of being behind the October attacks. And it seems that there are a lot of reports of quite a lot of civilians dying in those attempted attacks. We still don't know what has actually happened to that individual, whether or not he has been killed or not. The Israelis aren't being 100% about it. So that's Gaza. The situation remains terrible. Access to humanitarian aid remains very limited. The famous jetty, the pier that the West and the Americans stuck on the side to get aid in, that is not really working, and that's going to be removed at some point, if not has been removed.
Oh, really? Because I'd read that it was sort of operational, but just at not a very not high volume.
Look, the problem is that thing was designed for rivers. It wasn't designed for choppy seas, and or for temporary beach landings or things like that, where you go in. If you know anything about the sea state varies, and there's a limit to how heavy the sea can get before that thing just starts breaking up. So at various stages, they've had to dismantle bits and nip it round the corner into Ashdod port, because that's the irony. There's a perfectly good port just up the road that could perfectly do this.
Well, I just wanted not to get too kind of novelistic about it, but that's just such an emblem of just how desperate to help the West were, but how impotent they were because Israel actually controlled all the access. So when there was a humanitarian crisis, it was a crisis that could have been alleviated more if Israel had allowed more in.
That is absolutely right, and also illustrated by the fact that I remember talking to policymakers about this, the origins of the pier as a policy initially was designed to put pressure onto the Israelis to allow access in, and then subsequently it became a symbol of Western activity, so that when the West were putting pressure on the Israelis to get more humanitarian aid in, the West could say, well, look, we're doing this, why can't you do that? In other words, the pier had a political symbolism as much as it did a practical one. So there's that. And then finally, just very quickly, on the northern border, there are still lots of worries that at some point the low-level conflict, low-level, high-level conflict between Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Israelis is going to heat up at some point, with fears that the Israelis will attack Hezbollah properly with force at scale. Simply because at the moment there is a buffer zone in northern Israel where about 80,000 Israelis have been removed, and they're currently living in hotels on friends' bunks and beds and things, and they're pretty unhappy that they can't go home.
Right, so David Lammy is in the region. Let's listen to a little clip of what he's been saying, and then you can decode it for us.
I hope that we see a hostage deal emerge in the coming days, and I am using all diplomatic efforts. Indeed, last week with the G7 nations, and particularly with Tony Blinken pressing for that hostage deal. And I hope too that we see a ceasefire soon, and we bring an alleviation to the suffering and the intolerable loss of life that we're now seeing also in Gaza.
So that's Labour's position. What is Labour's position, really?
Well, the overt position is that they want an immediate ceasefire, they want to get humanitarian aid in, and they want the hostages released. Those are the three things that Mr. Lammy has been repeating at length. But what is interesting about this trip is that he's doing all the right things. He's ticking the right box. He's going to see, he's been to see Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's been to see the newish Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Mr. Mustafa. He's been to see hostage families. Some of those links with the UK, others not. He's been to see the Israeli president. So he's doing the rounds and seeing all the people that anybody would expect. What's really interesting about this trip is it's very, very controlled when it comes to media. no media travelling with him.
Well, I'm surprised you're not there.
Well,
but that's why.
You might say that. So let me make a contrast. When David Cameron was appointed to the position of Foreign Secretary last autumn, he took me with him on his trip, and we got all access. When, for example, the new Defence Secretary, Mr. Healy, went to Kiev immediately after the election,
the day after,
he took the political editor of the Sun newspaper with him, and I remember seeing pictures of the political editor of the Sun actually sitting in the meetings, with Mr. Healy.
Posted a picture of Zelensky.
So there's choices about access.
Yeah.
In this case, Mr. Lammy has chosen not to take anybody with him. And that is, I think, because he knows he's going to get questions that he doesn't yet have answers to. He did, in fairness to him, a pull clip, one of those things where a broadcaster asks questions on behalf of all the other British media, and we get, the answers back, and they're fed to everybody. And the questions he was asked then were all the questions actually we want to know, which is the Labour government going to ban arms sales to Israel? What does it think about international humanitarian law? Does it believe that the British weapons that are being sold are potentially in breach of international humanitarian law?
Sorry to interrupt, because previously the Conservative government kind of took a very legalistic view of that, and they said, if our lawyers in the Foreign Office tell us something has changed, we will think about stopping those arms sales. But the lawyers haven't said anything yet, which provoked the reaction from other people saying, well, the law is one thing, but you also have values and politics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Any government could stop arms sales just because it wanted to make a policy decision. But it is based on the law. When he was in opposition, Mr. Lammy called for some of that legal advice to be published. Whether he's as keen now that he's in government remains to be seen. But those are the questions he's going to be asked. Also, is the UK going to carry on or start refunding the UN agency in Gaza, UNRWA, which it stopped funding some time ago when there were allegations of links with Hamas and involvement between some people who work for the agency and the October attacks? And there's also the really interesting question about the International Criminal Court, which, if you remember, the prosecutor for that court has asked the court to issue an arrest warrant for Mr. Netanyahu for alleged war crimes. Now, the former government put up a sort of legal red flag and said, hang on a minute, is that fair? Is Israel technically under the jurisdiction of the ICC, this court, or not? It's a sort of legal, but it was seen as very much a delaying tactic. There's also the question of the International Criminal Court, because this is the court, if you remember, the chief prosecutor has asked the court to issue an arrest warrant against Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, for alleged war crimes, and also the Hamas leaders as well. Now, the British government, the former British government, led by the Conservatives, said they raised a legal red flag and said, look, hang on a minute. Does the ICC, this court, actually have jurisdiction over the Israelis? Because they don't recognise it. Like the Americans. The Americans don't recognise the court. So does it still have jurisdiction? Which was seen by many as a delaying tactic. So the current new government has to decide whether or not to take that red flag off the table and allow the ICC to carry on. Now, I think the reason Mr. Lammy was not keen to be persistently asked about this at every occasion on a trip to Israel is, I think, two reasons. One is because I think it's just the early days of a new government. They wanted to get their ducks in a row. I think also that they didn't want to be seen to be rushing into a decision on this that was somehow perhaps be seen as a response to the election. Because if you remember, obviously, the election was very difficult for Labour when it came to this issue. Some MPs were not elected because of people voting in favour of pro-Gaza.
Potentially 5 seats that they didn't win.
5 seats. And I think, so there's a sense within the Labour Party, say, look, we don't want to be seen to be making decisions simply a response to some kind of electoral pressure. They want it to be seen as deliberative. But also, I think that, as ever, these kind of issues take time to work through. And we've got to remember, this government is only, 10 days old. They're still trying to work out where the coffee machine is and how to work the printer. And so these kind of decisions, I think, they'll just want it to... But Mr. Lammy, in his pool clip, made very clear that he will make these announcements, in due course, shortly to Parliament. So I don't think they're that far off.
And presumably, though, David Lammy doesn't know where the printer is or the coffee machine because he's hardly been in his office, because actually he's been travelling, 75% of the time since the election?
Yeah, and that's what foreign secretaries do. They travel. They are there to be outside of the country, batting for Britain. And if you think about it, when you're a new foreign secretary in a new government, you've got a lot of people to see, engage with, just touch base with, so that when you actually need to start having proper conversations with them, you've already done the hi, how are you, nice to meet you, did I know your father or something.
And just to go back to the Israel-Gaza situation, I mean, people talk about peace, and it seems like a sort of quite ridiculously big word to bandy about. But in terms of the process for achieving, whether it's a ceasefire in the short term or a more permanent kind of long-term answer, where are we at?
Well, certainly no long-term answer. The short-term possibility of a ceasefire and hostage release by the Hamas, I mean, those talks continue on and off, involving the Egyptians, the Qataris, the Israelis, and obviously Hamas and the Americans. Remember, they're proxy talks. The Israelis and Hamas are not talking directly to each other. But those talks,
hence why it takes so long as well, because there's like multiple layers to go through.
And actually, the real reason why there's length of time is getting information and decisions back from the Hamas leadership from within Gaza, because for obvious reasons that's hard.
And then just where we started the episode, looking at the situation in the US. I mean, is Biden making any headway with his plan for Gaza? Because he's got his threefold plan, hasn't he? Or actually, does his domestic troubles and everything else that's happening in America mean that actually this just doesn't get any attention anymore?
Look, I think everybody is aware that there is a particular window before the US election bites hard, but that window is getting smaller and smaller and narrower as every day goes by. And I think right now the focus of the Biden administration is on survival. And how to deal with the political pressures against Biden from within his own Democratic team, but also the events of the weekend and how that's going to transform things. So I think at the moment, as ever, US attention is on itself rather than in the rest of the world.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We've recorded some bonus bits that you can listen to in the podcast edition, which is available on BBC Sounds. And we'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.